Hey everyone, so today I really want to talk about the leftist books that have most influenced my life and the ways in which they have impacted me. These aren't necessarily the leftist books that I would most recommend, but they are books that I think are really amazing, and within leftist spaces there's often a very homogenized, prescriptive idea of the type of books that we're supposed to read. They're often written by white men from years ago in inaccessible, indigestible language. I definitely think there's a lot we can learn from these books and these theorists, but I think there's a lot of books written today that express the same ideas in much more accessible, easy to read language that are often more engaging and emotional and personable to read, and those are the kind of books that I really enjoy. Also, I just wanted to say that you absolutely don't need to read any of the books that I recommend or read theory in general to be a leftist. Throughout history there were so many communists and socialists who were completely illiterate. I do think reading can be a powerful tool, and it can be an act of deep listening to other people's experiences, but at the same time I know that not everyone has the time or the ability to read as much as I do, so I definitely don't think that everyone needs to do it. And also, reading is kind of how I like to learn, but I know different people have different learning styles. Many leftist books are very depressing and focus on what we need to tear down, so I'm really glad that I included a lot of books that are focused on what we can build and have this undercurrent of hope. So with all of that out the way, I really wanted to start with this book by Akala called Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. And Akala is just an incredible human being. He's a rapper, an author, an activist, a poet, and this is probably hands down the absolute best audiobook that I've ever read. He has the most compelling and charismatic way of speaking that I really felt like my mind didn't wander at all whilst I was listening to the audiobook, and also getting it in paperback. The paperback version has also been incredible as well. But I just found that the way in which he spoke about his experiences was so compelling, because he said everything in such a matter-of-fact way, even when he was expressing the most disturbing things that had happened to him throughout his life, which makes you just realize just how much this is just an ordinary fact of life for him. Akala really takes you on this conversational journey of the ways in which race, class, and the British Empire intersect, told through the eyes of a mixed-race boy growing up in the 1980s in London. It mainly focuses on Britain, but it also takes you all across the globe and shows you the impact of the British Empire throughout the world. I'm so incredibly amazed with the way in which Akala is able to make such complex issues so digestible, but without oversimplifying everything. And he's really able to cover so much ground in terms of talking about history, identity, the police, sexual orientation, colonialism, so many facts that I'd previously never heard of before. And I think what makes this so impactful for me is how he's able to integrate the personal with the political. He really talks about his own personal experiences, but then links it all to broader structures, and it really enables you to put a human face on these deadly statistics, really enables you to feel in your bones the stuff that he's talking about. A lot of the time when I read books that are written by men, I often find that they have quite a arrogant tone in the way that it's written. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about or if you noticed that as well, but I was really amazed, and I thought it was so powerful the way in which Akala managed to have such a humility in the way he expressed his ideas, both in his writing and in his speech, and it really felt like less of a war cry, more of a dissection. Throughout the book, he really is able to preemptively debunk so many myths that are propagated by white Britain, such as the idea that William Wilberforce was this white saviour that freed black people from slavery, and he does so in such a clear, concise, compelling way. It's just impossible to disagree with what he's saying. I'm honestly continuously disturbed by how little most British people know about colonization, and throughout my time at school I never once learnt about colonization. We only learnt about how great we were during World War II. During the BLM protests there was this common sentiment that racism is only really something that happens in the US. In the UK it's not a problem, and I think that this book is so powerful and so needed because of the collective ignorance within Britain. There's almost zero acknowledgement of our own history of racism and our own complicity in perpetuating racist structures. And I definitely think this needs to be compulsory reading within British schools, because we can't continue to have this collective ignorance around our past. I found this book so compelling because it made me realise how much I still have to learn about racism and the British Empire and our history of colonisation. It definitely was a very humbling experience for me to recognise how much I still had to learn. Even though I felt like I'd already learned a lot, I realised just how little I did actually know. It really made me realise the extent of my privilege and really made me think about the internalized racism that I have. I'd also highly recommend just typing Akala into YouTube, checking out his music, and also all of his talks that he's given on various panels, because he really has such an incredible way of expressing ideas.
When we talk about race, we tend to focus on individual acts of prejudice, which is why UKIP often come up, because they'll overtly say stuff that we find offensive. But unfortunately, the issue of race, if we understand it, is a lot more insidious. And it takes a lot more of a historical view to understand the difference between individual bias and structural racism and privilege. And the idea of Great Britain was intimately tied to the fact that Britain's invaded almost every country on the earth, literally. No, literally, there's a map, you can Google it. And so the idea of our greatness was intimately tied to this idea of empire, which was intimately tied to what Rudyard Kipling calls the white man's burden, to go and civilize all these stupid brown folks that have been writing and having civilizations for thousands of years. But let's forget all of that. And so if we fast forward to today, when we talk about structural racism in Britain, do we have the same institutional disparities in rates of imprisonment that they have in America? Yes, absolutely we do. Do we have the same disparities in terms of who's dying in police custody? Yes, indeed we do. In 2011, we were told we loved Libyans so much we wanted to bomb democracy into them. Less than 5 years later, we're leaving people fleeing the same conflict to drown in the sea, while giving a woman space in a national newspaper to refer to them as cockroaches. And when you refer to humans as cockroaches, that is a mandate for murder. Let's be clear about that. No matter what, the 700 people that were left to drown off the coast of the Mediterranean, were they white human beings, they wouldn't have been left to drown. And they certainly wouldn't be called cockroaches.
The next book I wanted to talk about is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teaching of Plants, which was recommended to me by the wonderful Mexi. And this book is just such a delight. It honestly feels like a melancholic orgasm in the soul. It just has this undercurrent of hope that I find really profound. And Kimmerer is basically an Indigenous woman, a member of the Potawatomi Nation. She is a scientist and a botanist, an author, a poet, and just an all-round incredible woman. This book basically synthesizes Indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge about ecology and the environment, and it really hammers home the importance of the scientific community and environmentalists and ecologists taking into consideration Indigenous knowledge. It's basically the best articulation of the social, cultural shift that we need to take if we are to have a planet to live on in 10 years' time that I've ever read. I really feel like this book had such a life-changing impact on me because of the way in which it completely transformed the way I relate to nature. I observe the natural world so much more. I go into nature far more. I even started talking to trees and talking to plants in my mind when I'm out in nature, because I'm trying to have a relationship with them and see them more as equal and us as interconnected. And so I'm often just talking to the tree and saying, thank you, tree, for giving me oxygen. I need you as much as I need my lungs. And I'm thanking the flowers for how beautiful they are. And it just completely transforms the way in which you view nature. So it's less of something that's there for my aesthetic experience or an object to be exploited. And you see things more as animate, and everything is connected in this interweb of life. And I think that even if sometimes I feel ridiculous talking to trees, I feel like it's just a completely beautiful way to live, even if it seems ridiculous. And I do think that this book has helped me to have a happier approach to life. When I'm eating, I'm often saying a prayer of gratitude to my food, or really thinking about where the objects come from that I have in my life. And I really like that she's never prescriptively telling you need to go and do these things, but there's such a message of gratitude and reciprocity and interconnectedness with the land and developing a relationship with the land that runs throughout the book, that it almost feels like I'm so excited to go and do these things after reading the book. I think we're often so hyper-focused on all the problems in the world that we forget about the beauty of the things that we're trying to preserve, and I really think this book is that reminder. It gave me a completely new lens through which to view the world, and there are so many things that I've adopted from this book. For example, I'm always talking about how nature is my biggest teacher, which I definitely got from this book, because I like to go out into nature now and to think about what I can learn from plants and also the revelations that I have within nature. And I think that there's such a motivating force being in nature because it really reminds me of what I'm trying to preserve. And I find that the more time I spend in nature, the more motivated I am to go out and do more work in social movements, because I look at the beauty of the world and I'm like, I want this to continue to be here in a few decades' time, and I'm not sure it will if we continue as we are. Anthropologists have been telling us for years that this nature-humanity binary that we have, where we see ourselves as fundamentally separate from nature, is a colonial, capitalist, patriarchal construct. And it's one of the most fundamental problems with our environmental movement, because if we see ourselves as separate from nature, then it gives us justification to destroy nature, to exploit nature. And that's why I think this book is so important, because Robin Wall Kimmerer is telling us a pathway away from seeing ourselves as separate from nature, learning from Indigenous knowledge to try and build more of a relationship with nature that goes beyond the usual rhetoric that we have within the environmental movement. So I really think this book needs to be read by every environmentalist and ecologist, or anyone that cares about having a planet to live on in a few decades' time. I also love that this book is more of a reconstruction rather than a deconstruction, and has such an undercurrent of hope throughout. And it's really difficult to talk about this book because it's one of those books where it becomes so absorbed in the recesses of my mind that it becomes less what I think and more how I think about things. I love this book so much that I actually bought her second book, Gathering Moss, which is all about moss, and I never thought I would ever care about reading about moss, but somehow she makes it so exciting, so I'd highly recommend checking that one out as well. But anyway, moving on to the next book, I really wanted to talk about Hunger by Roxane Gay, which is this book. And Roxane Gay, if you don't know already, although you probably do, is an author, professor, social commentator, editor, just an all-round incredible person. Before reading this, I would say heavy trigger warnings for sexual violence and eating disorders, body issues, fat phobia. It's definitely not a light read. It covers a lot of soul-troubling topics, but I thought it was such an incredibly raw, powerful, vulnerable story of her life. It's basically all about Roxane Gay's lifelong journey living in a large body and what it is like to live in a large body in a fat-phobic society. So it talks first about her gang rape as a child and the subsequent CPTSD, and how these events led her to use food as a fortress to protect herself from the world. As you know from my video about body positivity, I have a lot of questions and concerns about the body positivity movement in general, because so much of the time it has such a hyper focus on hyper positivity and total acceptance of our bodies that can often make us feel guilty for not liking our bodies. But then at the same time, there are often so many books that are focused on triumph and overcoming our bodies until we've reached perfection. So this book is just so refreshing because it isn't a story of triumph or overcoming. Roxane Gay talks a lot about all of her struggles continuing today. One part of the book where she expresses this really well, she says, "People see bodies like mine and they make their assumptions. They think they know the why of my body. They do not. This is not a story of triumph, but this is a story that demands to be told and deserves to be heard." One thing I would say though is if you're looking for more of a systemic analysis of body issues and fat phobia, this probably isn't the book for you, because she does touch on some of these systemic issues, but only superficially. It's more of a personal memoir and it's more focused on her own personal experiences. I personally really loved this, and I didn't think that the lack of analysis detracted from what she was saying. If anything, I felt like it added to it, because because one of the most compelling things about this book and why I feel it has been so transformative to my life is because it really taught me the power of making the personal political, and how much vulnerability, openness, honesty, sharing these deep, intense, heart-wrenching moments can be so compelling for people. I actually did a research paper a few years ago where I looked into effective communication strategies for getting people involved in climate change action, and one of the main findings I found that I thought were really interesting is that information alone doesn't really get people compelled to get involved in any kind of climate action or social justice action in general. Instead, what really moves people is emotional stories and individual stories. And I think this book just really made me realize just how true all of that research is, at least for me. And I think it really shifted the way in which I want to show up online, offline, in my day-to-day life, in terms of wanting to bring more of that honesty, vulnerability, openness into the work that I do. For example, you might have noticed in my last few videos that I have been more focused on talking about some of my personal experiences and making them political, like with my court experience and the criminal justice system and how that related to prison abolition. And I can really attribute that to books like Hunger that really made me realize just how powerful this personal lens can be. The next book I wanted to recommend is called Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities by Rebecca Solnit, who's an author and an activist, and it's basically making the case for a commitment to hope, and it does so in such a quiet, contemplative, meditative way that feels incredibly compelling. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's feeling as if there is no hope for the future, because I felt like so many of the points that she made really did reshape the way in which I view the world, and I feel like I do have much more of a hopeful lens through which to view the work that I do, and it deeply inspired the video that I'm making that's coming out soon on radical hope. And she weaves together so many strands from her own personal experiences in activism and her own life, and also a critique of certain leftist people and certain leftist tendencies, but also brings in social movement theory and loads of history, as well as what's going on all across the globe, and gives so many examples, and also brings in so many quotes from different authors and disciplines. So it's not so academically rigorous as some people might like, but I personally really loved the way in which she was able to make all this information incredibly digestible. It's so accessible, so easy to read. I would just highly recommend to anyone, basically, because it's the type of message that I think we all need, because hopelessness is one of the things that is most destructive to our movements, because it makes everyone disengage and burnt out. And if we can get everyone to have some semblance of hope for the future, we would be far more likely to be successful in our movements. So the next book I wanted to recommend is The Hope of Liberation Within World Religion, and this book was recommended to me by Damon Garcia, who's an incredible YouTuber who talks about the intersections between Christianity and leftism. And this book is all about liberation theology, which, if you don't know, is about bringing justice to the poor and oppressed in the world, and every chapter of this book is written by a different scholar in a different religion, so it covers a vast amount of religions. It's quite a large book, but it does so in such an easily accessible way. It's not overly theoretical or overly academic, so you really get a taster into so many different religions and how they understand liberation, but also how these liberation movements and how these different religions can work together. I also loved how it talked about how emancipatory faith could provide so much spiritual strength and courage for people within different social movements. So I felt like it really brought together the spiritual and the political so well, and it showed the way in which politics can learn from spirituality and spirituality from politics. This book was so compelling to me because so much of the time when we think of religions, we think of it as this oppressive force that's incredibly Eurocentric and we should completely reject it. But this really articulated to me the liberatory potential of faith traditions, of spirituality. The book at one point even says itself that the real struggle is not between Christianity and Islam or Hinduism and Buddhism, rather the struggle occurs between the world's disenfranchised and the materialist religiosity of the world's elite. I found this book so helpful in talking to my very religious family to try and express to them that Christianity is not antithetical to leftist values and that Jesus was actually a communist, and all these ideas that I feel have definitely sparked seeds in my family's minds. So it can be a valuable resource to give to people that you know. But I also just found it personally such a fulfilling experience to read this book, because it helped me to realize just how much I believe that we need some sort of spiritual, cultural revolution and not just a political revolution if we are to have any hope of bringing about a better world. So of all the books that I mentioned, this is probably my favourite. It's called Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation, and it's by Silvia Federici. She's a scholar, activist, teacher, and this is probably hands down one of the best non-fiction books I've ever read in my life. The book basically follows the witch hunts from the 15th to the 17th century, where something like 200,000 women were murdered. And one of Federici's main arguments is that these witch hunts weren't just a result of medieval hysteria, which is usually how they're characterized, but this was actually a political campaign to destroy the power of women. A lot of leftists talk about this time purely in terms of class, but Federici is arguing that just as integral to the transition from feudalism to capitalism was the destruction of women. And the reason they did this is because the capitalist elite at the time needed a way to suppress the rebellions that were rising up against them, many of which were run by women. So in order to suppress them, they pitted working class men against working class women by decriminalizing the rape of poor women, decriminalizing prostitution, criminalizing sex work, relegating women to the kitchen. I think one of the most disturbing parts of this book was recognizing how so many of the tactics that were used back then by the capitalist elite are still being used today. It was also just mind-blowing to realize that in many ways, women before the 17th century or during the 17th century actually had more rights than women do now in many respects, because it wasn't until the witch hunts that there was the criminalization of homosexuality and sex work and contraception and abortion. And it's so fascinating to think about the fact that the witch hunts didn't stop because people realized that witches had never existed or that there weren't any witches anymore. They only stopped when they had fulfilled their purpose. And that is quite a disturbing thought to me. Another thing I loved about the book is that it's beautifully illustrated with paintings and woodcuts and drawings from publications of each of the periods that it's talking about. I would say it's probably the most academic book that I've mentioned today, and if that's not really your thing, she has a second book called Women, Witches and Witch Hunting, in which she breaks down a lot of the ideas that she talks about in this book into much more accessible language. I haven't read all of that book. I've read about half of it, but so far it seems really great, so that might be useful to you. But this book was so compelling to me because I actually ended up writing my thesis on a very similar topic to this, because I was so compelled by the ideas that she's talking about. I mean, I haven't written it yet, I'm still working on it, but it's going to be on very similar topics because I was so inspired by it. And then I also got onto this train of thought where I was thinking about magic and witchcraft in general, and clearly this was a really subversive practice, and I'm wondering now if there's much we could learn about the rituals around magic and witchcraft, or at least the knowledge that these people possessed, these so-called witches possessed, or these healers possessed at the time, because clearly it must have been very subversive of the capitalist system for it to have been destroyed. So I'm really thinking about learning more about these practices in general and whether they can be helpful in resistance struggles. This book also really made me think about how I relate to my body, because it talks about how such a large part of the transition from feudalism to capitalism was turning the body into a work machine, and it really made me think about the way I relate to my body. Another really surprising, unexpected impact this book had on me is how mobilizing and motivating it was for me to get even more involved in anti-capitalist resistance struggles, because just the way it explained all of these rebellions that so many people, particularly women, were a part of during this time, and their resilience and determination, and just the types of actions and resistances that they were a part of just really inspired me to also think about more ways in which I could do the same. It always is really inspiring to read about other people who have come before us, who have thought the same struggles that we are today. I really can't overstate the brilliance of this book. Please, please, please read it if it's something that you're interested in. And on the topic of books that cover resistance struggles and are inspiring and motivating in that way, I would also really recommend We Are Everywhere, The Irresistible Rise of Global Anti-Capitalism. And this is basically a book full of collections of stories of resistance struggles throughout the ages. It's such an inspirational collection of writing, images, ideas, all about direct action from people engaged in anti-capitalist movements all across the globe. It has so many beautiful images in it as well. The same can be said for this book, The 100 Nasty Women of History by Jewell, and it's essentially a collection of stories of badass women throughout history who resisted capitalism or did incredible things with their lives, but obviously aren't remembered because at the time they were alive, women didn't have many rights. And just to give you an idea of some of the topics covered, it says women as geniuses, women who did dangerous things, women as ancient weirdos, impressive kill counts, women who fought empires and racists, women who punched Nazis, women who were revolutionary role models. So I think it's a really great one to give as a gift to people as well. The final book I wanted to recommend is Queering Anarchism, Addressing and Undressing Power and Desire, written by a collection of authors. And I was a little bit reluctant to talk about this book just because I haven't read any other queer theory apart from this book, so I don't really know if my opinion counts for very much, but I thought I would mention it anyway because this book has been really transformative for me in many ways since I read it. And Nicole from Pink Spots raves about this book, and they know far more than I do about this topic, so I really trust their opinion. But essentially, it covers the intersections between queer theory and anarchism and what both can learn from each other. Just to give you an idea of the type of things it covers, some of the chapter headings are queer meet anarchism, gay marriage and queer love, police at the borders, radical queers and class struggle, tyranny of the state and trans liberation, queering the economy, a diversity of sex tactics, and so many more. And it's written by a diverse array of authors. And one thing I thought was really interesting about this book is that it's actually deliberately set up that every single author doesn't agree with each other. It has such an array of perspectives. So I definitely found myself not agreeing with everything in this book, and some of the language is definitely outdated. But I love that they weren't here to tell you this prescriptive blueprint of what you're supposed to think and what you're supposed to follow. It really enables you to come up with the answers for yourself and really reflect on what ideas resonate with you, what is true for you. And the book actually explicitly talks about this when it says, if everyone inspired by anarchism agreed exactly on what it was, how it worked, and how it felt, would it still be anarchism? It's definitely a book that I would recommend reading slowly. It asks so many profound, powerful questions that I found myself stopping after every chapter, or often after certain pages, just to write down my thoughts as I went, to reflect on what is being said. It's a really good book for introspection, good for conversation starters. I definitely felt like there were so many ways in which I realized I needed to change the way I was doing certain things in my life that I had previously taken for granted, and I feel like that is really powerful. This book really helped me to realize how much I'm still conditioned into heteronormativity and how much more work I have to do to dismantle that, because I recently realized I'm bisexual, but I'm realizing just how much conditioning I have around believing that sex and relationships with men is somehow more valid, more of an achievement than with non-men. I'm also realizing just how much I'm buying into these compulsory performances of gender all the time and how much performance of femininity I do that I don't even want to be doing. One of the chapters of the book that I found particularly compelling was on queering heterosexuality, because it really made me realize just how much of my heterosexual relationships have been so focused on the male gaze, the male orgasm, and on penetration, and just how liberating it could be to completely queer up my heterosexual situationships by getting rid of these gendered norms and stereotypes and sexual taboos that have been fed to me my whole life. But I found it such a transformative concept to think about queerness not just as something that relates to the queer community, but a lens through which to view the world in general, queering up a whole entire worldview. And it definitely made me reflect on how I can queer up the world around me in multiple ways. So yes, this book has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I really feel like it could be incredibly transformative for so many other people as well. There were so many other books that I'm actually supposed to have covered in this video, but I'm realizing that I've talked so long already, and I'm a bit worried that this video is going to be too long, so I might do a second video just on general reading recommendations if you would like that. I would also quite like to do one of these on fiction books as well, because I read a lot of fiction. But yeah, just let me know what you would prefer and I can look into doing that for you if you would like. I would also really love to hear your reading recommendations and also what you thought about the books that I mentioned. And I love talking about books, and this has been really fun for me, so thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to all of my patrons for making this video possible. I would really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron to help me to continue to make videos. Over on Patreon, I'm currently trying to do one video a month for patrons and a monthly favourites where I talk about books, films, quotes, music that I've been loving. And I also do a bi-weekly Discord call with Mexi where we talk directly to the patrons. So if that's something you're interested in, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much for watching and for listening to me. I'd love to hear what you think about all the books that I mentioned, what books were the most transformative for you and why. I think it's quite a therapeutic thing to do, to really think about the things that have moved us and why they moved us, and to share them with other people. I think it's quite a beautiful thing to do. So anyway, thank you for taking the time to listen to me and to watch this video, and I will speak to you all very soon. Bye!